Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining today. I am Jen Butler, NLIHC's Vice President of External Affairs. We are happy to have you on today's press call for the 2023 release of our annual report, Out of Reach: The High Cost of Housing. This year's report highlights how unaffordable rents and the end of many pandemic-era benefit programs have put new pressures on low-income renters. And on this call, we're going to share key findings, reflections, and policy solutions that are needed to address the housing crisis. We're going to begin the call today with remarks from NLIHC's President and CEO, Diane Yantel. Just a couple of housekeeping pieces before we move into the agenda. We just want to let everyone know that we're going to address questions at the end of the call that are submitted in the Q&A box. Please do submit all of your questions there. And if there are any remaining questions following the call, or if you have any follow-up interview requests, please email me directly. And of course, you all have my email at jbutler@nlihc.org. And so I'll turn it over now to NLIHC's President and CEO, Diane Yantel.
Thanks, Jen. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the release of this year's Out of Reach report, which highlights the housing wage, which is the amount that someone must earn an hour in order to afford a modest studio, 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. So this year we released the Out of Reach report as inflation and rent increases cool, but remain well out of reach for the country's lowest income people. Recent rent increases affected tenants nationwide, worsening and deepening the housing crisis. Between January of 2021 and June of 2022, median rents in the US increased by 25%. At the same time, costs for necessities like food and transportation also increased, leaving low-income renters with unsustainably tighter budgets and forced to make really difficult trade-offs in their budget, sacrificing childcare, medical care, and store-bought food to maintain housing. Even prior to the recent rent hikes, renters were facing the effects of a long-standing trend of rents rising faster than wages. Nationally, between 2001 and 2021, real median rents increased by about 18%, while real median household incomes only increased by a little over 3%. So increased rents result in increased homelessness. The US Government Accountability Office has found that a $100 increase in median monthly rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness, and rents rose by nearly $200 per month in recent years. And indeed, as a direct result of rising rents, homelessness is increasing in many communities throughout the country. From a 7% increase in homelessness when compared to the year before in Phoenix, Arizona, to a 22% increase in San Diego, a 52% increase in parts of Florida, a 36% increase in Savannah, Georgia, 40% increase in Twin Falls, Idaho, 54% increase in Montgomery County, Maryland, a 22% increase in Columbus, Ohio, a 9% increase in Oklahoma, and on throughout the country. While communities are successfully rehousing individual people every day, they cannot stem the tide of people falling newly into homelessness or who are on the cusp due to a lack of homes affordable and available to the lowest income people and woefully inadequate federal funding for solutions. Decades of chronic underfunding for housing assistance results in what's essentially a housing lottery system in our country, where only the lucky 25% of eligible households receive the housing assistance that they need. So with homelessness worsening and millions of families struggling to stay housed, federal investments in expanding proven solutions like housing choice vouchers, the National Housing Trust Fund, public housing, emergency rental assistance are badly needed and long overdue. Yet House Republicans are currently actively working to dramatically worsen the housing and homelessness crisis in their communities and across the country by writing appropriations bills that could cut HUD's budget by an astonishing and untenable 25%. If enacted, these cuts would put almost 1 million of the lowest income American families at risk of losing their rental assistance entirely. And the harm of these cuts are compounded by the fact that in FY24 alone, HUD needs at least a $13 billion increase in funding just to maintain current levels of service due to inflation, higher rents, and interest rate hikes. So to mitigate harm, Congress and the Biden administration must take every action possible to prevent this nearly 1 million of the lowest income families from losing their housing assistance. If these proposals hold and rental assistance is cut, families will face dramatic rent increases, putting them at higher risk of eviction and, in worst cases, homelessness. As a country, we have the data, the partnerships, the expertise, the solutions, and the means to end homelessness and housing poverty. We lack only the political will to fund solutions at the scale necessary. And our intent in releasing today's report, in writing and releasing it, is really to equip reporters like you, policymakers, advocates, and citizens to understand and tell the story of the housing crisis locally and nationally, and to push policymakers to fund and implement solutions. So you'll hear more details about the findings in the report from my colleagues later on the call. And I just want to thank you again for joining today, and I will turn it back to Jen. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. We will now turn it over to 3 of the 4 authors of the report's preface. On the call today, we're going to have Congresswoman Nanette Diaz-Barragan, Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, and Congresswoman Cori Bush. We're going to begin with Congresswoman Barragan. And we thank them again so much for joining and are going to be flexible if their schedule requires them to step away. Congresswoman Barragan.
It's my understanding she's, this is Representative Bonamici. I don't see Representative Barragan yet. Should I go ahead?
Yes, that would be great. And so again, thank you so much for your flexibility.
Oh, terrific. Okay, and thank you, Jen, thank you, Diane. Thank you so much to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for inviting us to join today. I appreciate my colleagues, my other co-chairs, really grateful for the coalition's dedication to advancing policies that help everyone access quality housing. Housing is a basic necessity. We know that, and we know that the lack of affordable housing imposes financial and other burdens on individuals, on families, and limits their potential. So we recently relaunched the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness, in large part to educate our colleagues about the importance of serving people experiencing homelessness and to focus on solutions to address these issues. The National Low Income Housing Coalition's Out of Reach report, thank you for this work. It's so critical, making clear how much more we need to do to keep people in homes, to get people experiencing houselessness into safe and affordable homes, and to increase support for the services they need to make those accessible, the services they need to be successful. So in my home state of Oregon, a worker making minimum wage would need 2 jobs to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, or they'd need to work 70 hours a week to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. That's unacceptable, and it's clear that wages are simply not keeping up with housing costs. And thank you, Diane, for emphasizing that. And I know we'll see that explained in the report. This reflects what I've heard from people across Northwest Oregon. The need for more affordable housing comes up in town hall meetings and in meetings on every topic. I had a telephone town hall meeting last night. Several people brought up the issue of affordable housing. We spoke with Kate. She lives in Astoria, Oregon, over on the coast. She's a small business owner. She just had to move back in with her parents because her rent increased 25% in 1 year. And we know that challenges with affordability are not limited to urban areas. They're also happening. These challenges also exist in suburban, rural, coastal communities where they're dealing oftentimes with costs identical to what we see in the urban core. So access to affordable housing is one of the best investments we can make. As the report highlights, emergency rental assistance and the eviction moratoriums, those were essential to keep people in their homes during the pandemic. And as co-chairs, we are leading a letter with more than 100 members signed on to provide $3 billion in rental assistance and to permanently extend the effective emergency rental assistance program. So we've been fighting for these overdue investments. Thank you, Diane, for recognizing that there's a woeful lack of resources coming out of Congress, but we are advocating for these common sense solutions. Also fighting to help everyone who's eligible access federal housing assistance. That includes converting housing choice vouchers to an entitlement so they will truly meet the needs in our community. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations about people who said, what good is a voucher if there's no place to use it? We must invest in expanding housing stock for low-income communities and make access a priority for people who are experiencing houselessness. Also, we need to expand access to the basic needs like SNAP to prevent families from having to choose between putting food on the table and paying for rent. I recently introduced my Support for SNAP Act, and that's to provide assistance in the application process so people experiencing houselessness can get the support they need to get some nutrition assistance. So these are just a few steps that we can take to reach a future where quality, affordable housing is available to all. So I look forward to our continuing partnership with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and my co-chairs on the caucus to make this vision of housing a reality for all. And thank you again for your work, for your advocacy, and let's get this done working together.
Thank you so much. We so look forward to your continued partnership and the work ahead as well. Thank you again for joining the call today. We are now going to turn it over to Representative Cori Bush. Representative Bush, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Jen, and thank you to our partners at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for inviting all of us, the co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness, to this important press conference. I'm proud to join my fellow co-chairs, Representative Bonamici and Barragan and Garcia, in authoring the preface to the NLIHC Annual Out of Reach Report. This thorough and well-researched annual report provides a blueprint for policymakers to follow to provide safe, affordable, guaranteed housing for all. I fully support the Housing First model, a people-centered strategy that accounts for the needs of the whole individual. In addition to immediately housing an individual, this model prioritizes access to wraparound support services such as substance use treatment, mental health counseling, nutrition programs, and employment strategy training needed to live stably in the community. And as a former nurse for a community-based mental health agency, the director of that agency, this is what we wanted for such a long time, and we built it on our own, but this is what we needed. This should have been the guide. Before we can honestly discuss housing justice solutions, we all must agree that there is a problem. The stark disparities between low wages and rising cost of rent leaves millions of renters housing insecure or at risk for eviction and homelessness. In my home state of Missouri, a minimum wage worker earning $12 per hour would have to work at least 62 hours per week to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. That doesn't include the cost of childcare and medical care, food, transportation, clothing, and other costs incurred by people trying to show up to work every day. And we know that Missouri is not even like the place where, has the highest cost of living. So what happens if that worker needs more than 2 bedrooms to start a family? What happens if that worker becomes sick? What happens if they become disabled and can't manage a 62-hour work week. Housing insecurity, evictions, and homelessness are constant threats to low-income renters. And if they do end up on the streets, like I did, they are often arrested, fined, or harassed by law enforcement for the crime of not having a home. I tell the story all the time about how I couldn't close my eyes at night for long when I was sleeping in the car with my 2 babies, because I just wasn't sure if I closed my eyes too long, if one of my babies would end up, I'd find them not breathing. But the other threat was if the police would be knocking at the door of the car and they would take my children from me. So neither housing insecurity nor homelessness, neither one are crimes, even though folks like us who have experienced or are experiencing it are treated like criminals. They're not crimes. They're policy failures. In a country where you can be arrested for sleeping in your car, like me, or sleeping in a tent, like my friends, or on the sidewalk, like people in my district, policymakers have failed. In a country where the cost of ending homelessness, we're talking about that $20 billion, costs less than 3% of the 73, let's say the defense budget, policymakers have failed. We know that defense budget keeps going up. This system is unsustainable and must be transformed from the bottom. That's why my fellow co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness and I have joined together to educate members of Congress and staff about the path to ending homelessness permanently. And it is absolutely imperative that we do so. We think that people understand, or they may want to hear because they're representatives, but those of us walking these halls, we know different. So we need to use every legislative tool at our disposal: appropriations, amendments, earmarks, and legislation. We have an obligation to bolster support for affordable housing developments, for eviction prevention measures, and rental and homelessness assistance programs. For this reason, all 4 co-chairs were unanimous in our opposition to the debt ceiling agreement. These programs are at risk of significant budget cuts, and it's still not off the table, which will exacerbate the worsening affordable housing crisis. Housing First includes bolstering support for the social safety net, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and Social Security programs, which I have benefited from all 4 of those in my lifetime, are programs that keep people alive and should not be up for negotiation or subjected to ineffective so-called work requirements. As we saw during the pandemic, survival stimulus checks, that's what I call them, expanded unemployment benefits that people don't have to pay back, eviction moratorium, and expanded earned income and child tax credits kept our economy from complete collapse. We have over 3 years of data and evidence to prove the Emergency Rental Assistance Program was a resounding success. Why not make it permanent? At least $3 billion per fiscal year, what goes a long way in preventing hundreds of thousands of evictions every single year. After our direct action on the Capitol steps nearly 2 years ago, I partnered with Senator Warren to introduce the Keeping Renters Safe Act and put in place a permanent ban on all evictions for the duration of the pandemic. I'm eager to reintroduce the Unhoused Bill of Rights next month and continue to craft a vision of a future that looks drastically different than our present and the one that we know and understand. The pandemic gave us a one-time opportunity to not only envision a different world, but to create it. Let's take those hard-fought lessons learned and transform them into affordable housing solutions. The Congressional Caucus on Homelessness will continue to work closely with all of our partners, especially our partners at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, to end the housing crisis and finally guarantee affordable housing for all. So thank you again for inviting the caucus to participate today.
And thank you both for the work of the caucus, for your continued advocacy, again, your partnership. And Representative Bush for sharing your experiences. Thank you. We also, in our report, uplift stories of people with lived experience as well. And so that is it's just so important to share. Thank you. We are now going to turn it over to our Senior Vice President of Research, Andrew Arand, who is going to go over the data of the report. Andrew?
Sure, thanks, Jen. I'm just gonna take a few minutes and give an overview of the findings that are in the report, some of the key findings. You know, as others have mentioned, Out of Reach highlights the gap that exists between the cost of rental housing and the income of low-wage workers and other families and individuals with extremely low incomes. And specifically, it answers the question, how much does a full-time worker need to earn in order to afford a modest apartment at fair market rent? And that dollar amount is what we call the housing wage. And in Out of Reach, we then compare the housing wage to what workers actually earn, particularly low-wage workers and in low-paying occupations. And I'll give a brief overview of the key findings of the report in a minute, but before I do that, I just want to explain a few things about how we arrive at these numbers. First, we follow a common assumption that is applied in many of our federal housing programs, and that rent and utilities should not exceed 30% of a household's income. And then second, we base our rental costs on HUD's fair market rents. And they are determined annually by HUD, and they reflect what a family moving today could expect to pay for rent and utilities for a modest apartment, or a modest apartment or rental home in their area. And from these two things, we calculate the housing wage, which, as I said, is the hourly wage that a full-time worker needs to earn to afford an apartment or rental home at HUD's fair market rent without spending more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. And on the next slide, start some of our key findings that I'll just give an overview of, and that is in the United States today, the average housing wage for a two-bedroom apartment is $28.58. And so that means, of course, that an individual working full-time, which to us is 40 hours per week, 52 weeks a year, would need to earn $28.58 an hour to afford a modest two-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And a full-time worker would need to earn on average $23.67 an hour to afford a one-bedroom apartment or rental home. And of course, it's no surprise that nowhere in the United States can a full-time worker earning the minimum wage afford a modest two-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And a full-time minimum wage worker could afford a one-bedroom apartment in only roughly 7% of counties in the US. And that's slightly more than 200 counties out of the 3,000 plus counties in the country. But rental affordability is a problem that affects far more workers than just those earning the minimum wage. If we go to the next slide, 13 of the most common occupations in the US pay a median wage that's less than the two-bedroom housing wage. And 10 of those occupations pay median wages that are less than the one-bedroom housing wage. And those 10 occupations whose median wages are less than the one-bedroom housing wage account for about a third of the workforce. And they are workers in occupations like retail, food service, home and health, personal care aides, building maintenance, janitorial services, administrative assistants, just to name a few. And I just want to mention, of course, you're all aware that housing costs vary quite a bit across the country. They even vary quite a bit within states. So we estimate the housing wage for every state, metropolitan area, and county in the US. And you can find state and local data on our website for the Out of Reach report. That is nlihc.org/OOR. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the report now. And, as I mentioned, of course, housing wage varies quite a bit across the country. This map is a state map showing the average two-bedroom housing wage for each state. That wage ranges from $16.27 in Arkansas all the way up to $42.25 an hour in California. The dark blue states on the map are the states that are the most expensive. The 5 most expensive states in 2023, and many of these would not be surprising to you, is California with the 2-bedroom housing wage of more than $42 an hour, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New York. Those 3 states all have a housing wage that's more than $40 an hour, and Washington State, whose housing wage for a 2-bedroom apartment is $36.33 an hour. But I do just want to note that even in states and places that seem to be a lot less expensive, they still present an affordability problem for low-wage workers in those areas. States and localities with lower cost housing also tend to have lower wages and lower minimum wages. So the workers with the lowest wages still struggle to find rental housing that they can afford. And extremely low income renters and the lowest wage workers struggle in every housing market across the country. The next map is a map of counties in the US, and it's a minimum wage map. It shows the number of hours that a minimum wage worker in each county needs to work to afford a 1-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent. And as I mentioned earlier, in only about 7% of counties can a full-time worker earning the minimum wage afford a 1-bedroom apartment. On average, a minimum wage worker needs to work about 86 hours a week. That's more than 2 full-time jobs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And as I mentioned in the introduction or in the brief overview, of course, that far more renters than just those earning the minimum wage struggle to afford their rent. This slide that you're seeing now shows the wage distribution in the US by percentiles. So the lowest 10% of wages are below the 10th percentile, the lowest 20% are below the 20th percentile, and so on. And you can see that the bottom 40% of wages and nearly, not quite half of all wages, are below the 1-bedroom housing wage, or what is needed by a full-time worker to afford the average fair market rent at 1 bedroom. So nearly slightly less than half of jobs in the US pay less than the 1-bedroom housing wage. And then on the next slide, we have this wage distribution broken down by race. And if you look at the third cluster of bars from the right, you'll see that the median wage, or the 50th percentile wage for white workers, is adequate for a full-time worker to afford a to afford a 1-bedroom rental home, but that the median wages for Hispanic workers or Black workers are clearly not adequate to afford rental housing. And in fact, if you look at the cluster of bars that's second from the right, you'll see that even at the 60th percentile, or the bottom 60% of wages for Black workers and 60% of wages for Hispanic workers are not adequate to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. And then on this final slide, or next to final slide, I should say, I mentioned occupations that pay less than the 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom housing wage. This is the chart of the 13 of the 20 most occupations that pay median wages that are less than what a full-time worker needs to afford affordable housing. And as I've mentioned, these occupations account for a significant share of the workforce. And so how do we resolve this housing affordability problem for the lowest income families and lowest wage workers? We have a number of policy solutions that we have to achieve at the federal level on the next slide. Nope. And so we're missing that slide, but I'll just mention our policy solutions, which others have mentioned as well. Is one, we need to increase federal resources for the preservation of existing affordable rental housing stock. And we need to expand the supply of deeply affordable units that would be affordable to renters with the lowest wages and the lowest incomes. You know, and our Out of Reach report, the one we're reviewing today, highlights a significant gulf between incomes of low wage workers and what they need to afford in their housing market. Our other annual report, called The Gap, highlights the severe shortage of housing units whose rents would be affordable for the lowest wage workers. In fact, nationally, we have a shortage of about 7.3 million rental homes for the lowest income families. And we really need to solve that gap. One way to do it is to increase federal resources for preservation and also to increase the supply of the affordable housing stock. One of the most important programs to do that is the National Housing Trust Fund. So we need to see a significant increase in resources for the trust fund, which basically acts like a grant to states who then use that money to preserve or create housing. We also need to expand access to housing choice vouchers, which provide rental assistance to renters so that they can afford housing in the private markets. And we also need an emergency fund or a housing stabilization fund that would provide short-term assistance to families who are in a sudden and unexpected financial crisis and can't afford their rent. We at the coalition have said for a long time that extremely low-income renters who are spending more than half of their income on rent are really just one crisis away from losing their home. And we sadly saw that play out during the pandemic to some extent. But we implemented emergency rental assistance, which really helped millions of families. And we need a more permanent program like that. And then finally, we need stronger tenant protections so that tenants are on equal legal footing as landlords. And this would include a ban on source of income discrimination. So landlords can't refuse voucher holders just because they have a voucher. Good cause eviction standards, so tenants can't be evicted arbitrarily at the end of their lease. Anti-rent gouging, for example, after disasters or other market upheavals, and also habitability standards. And as I mentioned, you can find the housing wage and rental cost data for all metropolitan areas and counties, including rural counties, in our full report online at nlihc.org/OOR. And I will leave it at that. And I open it up for questions, I think.
Thank you, Andrew, so much. And yes, but just ahead of questions, we do have Representative Barragan who was able to join the call. Thank you so much. And we're going to turn it over to her for her reflections of the report. Thank you again so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here today. Thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for organizing this call, and congratulations on the publication of your 2023 Out of Reach report. I want to thank you for the opportunity to collaborate on the preface of the report with my colleagues and fellow co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness. Our Homelessness Caucus's objective is to advocate for solutions and funding to help end homelessness in our country. The Out of Reach report is a critical tool to meet this objective. The report's localized data is valuable to policymakers at all levels. It can help us better understand the widening gap between housing costs and income. The collected data and experiences illustrate that many renters across our country are overburdened by housing costs and are at risk of homelessness. As the report highlights, this is a reality for many of my constituents in Los Angeles County, where a 2-bedroom apartment costs over $2,200 a month. A working single mother making the state minimum wage would need to work over 100 hours a week to afford this unit. For many extremely low-income households in my district of California's 44th district, this is simply out of reach. For these families, affordable rent looks more like $737 a month. Now, due to the lack of affordable housing and high rent costs, families have no option but to choose between housing and other basic needs. So what can Congress do? As my colleagues and speakers have mentioned, Congress must invest in housing for low-income families. We must provide wraparound services. We must support programs that keep people housed, such as Medicare and SSI. We must raise the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage hasn't been increased in over a decade. Congress also needs to invest in homelessness prevention measures, things like legal services for households facing eviction. We know that when a tenant has access to counsel, they are more likely to avoid an eviction compared to households that are unrepresented. These programs can help many individuals and families remain housed and prevent our homelessness crisis from worsening. The last issue I'd like to raise, which is also mentioned in the report, is the need to remove barriers for the formerly incarcerated. Now, these individuals face enormous obstacles to housing and are more likely to be homeless. In fact, in Los Angeles County, 70% of our unsheltered homeless population has had some type of involvement with or interaction with the criminal justice legal system. That's why I've introduced a bill in April that would help provide housing assistance and supportive services for the formerly incarcerated. And to address and prevent homelessness throughout the United States, we must pass policies that provide affordable housing and supportive services for our most vulnerable communities. I look forward to working with my colleagues in Congress and partners like you at the National Low Income Housing Coalition to create the necessary solutions to address our housing and homelessness crisis. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all of your work. And with that, I'll pass it on to Diane.
Thank you so much, Representative. I'm actually going to jump right back in for questions from the media. And to quote Diane, we look forward again to the partnership and onward with all the collaborative work ahead. So we are now going to pivot again, after just, again, such gratitude to all the representatives of the caucus for joining the call today. We're going to move forward with questions from the media. So we are going to address any questions in the Q&A box. If you have any specific questions for any of the representatives, please do email me directly so that I can coordinate with them if they are not addressed here on this call. But in the meantime, let's jump right into the Q&A box. We see one question so far, and this is for Diane. With the labor shortage throughout the pandemic, we've seen more employers paying higher than the minimum wage to attract hourly workers. Can you speak a little bit more about why this hasn't been enough to offset the rising rent costs? And she's speaking specifically to Seattle, Washington.
Thanks, Jen. I'm happy to answer that. It also looks like Heidi sent a follow-up saying that she was directing the question to Andrew. So maybe I'll start it off and then pass it on to Andrew. But in Washington, it looks like the minimum wage is nearly $16 an hour, but the housing wage is $36.33 an hour. So even if employers are paying above the minimum wage, which they should, and is helpful, it's not keeping up with the rising costs of rent. In some parts of Washington, it looks like rents over the past decade have doubled, and clearly the wages have not. But Andrew, I'll turn to you if you want to add anything to that.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I think the two things, nationally speaking, one thing about Wages Economic Policy Institute has pointed out that, between 2019 and 2022, the lowest income workers saw the greatest wage growth. The rate of growth in wages was greatest for the lowest income workers, which is great. But that wage growth was 9%, which when you think about the lowest wage workers, I think that equates to about $1.10 an hour more. At the same time, nationally, we saw rents increase in 2021 by 18%, and then over 18 months between the beginning of 2021 and mid-2022 by 25%. So, it's great that and necessary that wages are increasing, but those increases have not kept pace nationally to rent increases, and that is true in most housing markets, I would say.
Thank you, Diane and Andrew. Emma Ackerman from Market Watch asks, would increased housing construction alone be enough to make prices affordable for low-income renters?
So I'd love to take that one and to combine it with the question that I see from Ginny Monk, who asks whether there are correlations between states with high housing costs and restrictive zoning policies. And so the answer to that is absolutely yes, that restrictive local zoning often inhibits the supply, the construction of apartments, really any kind of apartments, and especially affordable apartments. And restricting supply in this way at a time of increasing demand drives up costs for everybody. And certainly it squeezes the lowest income people the most. So states and localities need to do more to remove these restrictive zoning laws. Even when and if they do, it won't be enough to make housing affordable for the lowest income people, for extremely low income, for very low income people. And that's because the private market on its own cannot build and operate homes that are affordable to extremely low income people on their own. And that's because the rent that extremely low income people can pay doesn't cover the costs to build and operate apartments. So that's a basic market failure that requires a government intervention, in this case, in the form of subsidies. So subsidies in the form of rental assistance to bridge the gap between what people earn and what rent costs. We need to build more apartments that are affordable specifically to extremely low income people through programs like the National Housing Trust Fund and preserving and expanding public housing. But to make homes affordable for the lowest income people, restrictive zoning policy, loosening of restricting zoning policies is necessary, but not enough.
Thank you. And Jenny Monk is with the Connecticut Mirror. Do we have any additional questions at this time? I'll give just a moment more for questions. And then again, if you do not have any questions here, but have any follow-up questions or interview requests following this call, please do email me directly, but I'll just give just a moment more just in case any.
Jen, this is
Oh, good.
Congresswoman Bonamici. I see a question from Heidi Groover about the role of state legislators, state legislatures and
sorry.
local governments in addressing the crisis, or is the problem so great? Can it only be truly addressed at the federal level? As a former state legislator, I know it is going to take state and federal and local all working together. It's not going to be solved just by local authorities or just by state legislators, just by members of Congress. I mean, there's a lot we can do at the federal level, including changes to the low-income housing tax credit, including funding more Section 8 vouchers, but also getting the apartments there for people. I just noticed looking at some information about Multnomah County in Oregon, they just opened up the list for people to apply to get on a wait list, and they had a couple thousand just in the first few minutes. There's just not enough supply. So to address this, it is going to take local authorities and state, and those are the sort of zoning issues, but also state policies, as well as federal investment in federal policies. And also public-private. It's going to take all of us working together.
Thank you. And from Molly with Route 50, asking how is the report comparing to last year's report? Is there anything surprising or new in the latest findings? Andrew?
So I don't know, anything surprising and new in terms of this affordability gap between rental costs and income, because we've had this problem for a long time. I think one of the things I've noticed, though, is, well, we briefly mentioned about the increase in wages, and we hear a lot about increasing wages. But I think, one thing that the Out of Reach really highlights this year is even those increases are not addressing the affordability problem adequately. And that leads me to one thing I have noticed over a long period of time, like over the last maybe 3 or 4 years of Out of Reach, is that, we do track minimum wages at the state and county level. And our list of local minimum wages that are higher than the federal minimum wage has increased quite a bit over those years, which is important, and that's great. But it also doesn't address the affordability problem because those local minimum wages that, are being implemented don't rise to the level of housing costs in those places. So this really is, it's partly an income problem, but it really is a housing problem. And we need to ensure that there's adequate affordable housing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. Are there any remaining questions as we are now at time to wrap the call? Well, thank you all again. Please do send any follow-up questions or interview requests to jbutler@nlihc.org. Please also visit nlihc.org and our Out of Reach webpage for all of the resource maps, report, everything is there. Thank you again to all the representatives, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and connecting with you all again soon. Have a great day.